Hi, and welcome back to the Chip Chats. This is Chapter 5, and in Chapter 5 we're going to be talking about the Ten Commandments. Chapter 6 is also going to be talking about the Ten Commandments, and what we're going to do is, in these two lessons, we're going to talk about how the Ten Commandments apply to Christians today. In recent years, there's been a big push for the Ten Commandments to be posted in various places. Some people want statues and monuments built in public squares that contain the Ten Commandments. Some want these same statues and monuments to be removed from the public places. Some want the Ten Commandments to be posted in classrooms. Some want the Ten Commandments removed from classrooms. And as Christians, we've got to be able to understand the difference. We've got to be able to make the distinction between the secular and the spiritual and the religious. We know that each and every day, whether the Ten Commandments are posted anywhere, we're guided by the law of God, the law of Jesus Christ, and we need to be able to make the proper application and teach the proper application of God's law and how it applies to us, how we're supposed to live each and every day. I would like to ask what is so disruptive or distracting about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, they give us good standards to live by. Do not steal. Do not murder. Do not lie. And we have to be able to take these and make the application in our lives, knowing that the intent that God had behind them, as He wanted His people who He gave the Ten Commandments to. He wanted them to be a very distinctive, different people. And He wants Christians today to be that same distinct, different people. I would just like to ask what is so disruptive and so distracting about the Ten Commandments. Why are the Ten Commandments so controversial? They seem to be controversial because if you read them, there is an acknowledgement that you have to make about God, that He is God, He is the God of creation, He is the God of heaven, and there comes an acknowledgement of God in the Ten Commandments. Another question that we might ask ourselves about the Ten Commandments is do the Ten Commandments have anything to do with our lives as Christians? Are Christians bound to keep the Ten Commandments? Well, the simple answer to both of these questions is no. The Christians are not bound by the Ten Commandments. They're part of the old law. We're not bound to keep them. They don't have anything to do with our lives today under the law of Jesus Christ. Like I said, the simple answer is no. The better answer is yes, as they are applied under the gospel of Jesus Christ. As we read and study and make an application of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as we make a study of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we learn that most of these are repeated in Christ's gospel, and these are things that we're supposed to live by as Christians. We're supposed to be this type of example as a Christian. We're supposed to be able to understand this, make the discernment and understand this. First of all, as we go back to the Old Testament, we've got to ask the question, who were the Old Testament, who was the old law, the Old Testament given to? Who were the Ten Commandments for? Well, they were part of the old law, and the old law was specifically for the Israelites. The Israelites left Egyptian captivity. And they crossed the desert and they came to Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, the Israelites received the law of God. Beginning in Exodus 19 and then going into Exodus 20, we can read their travel to Mount Sinai, and we can read of them receiving the law of Moses, the old law. In Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17, and in Deuteronomy 5, verses 6 through 22, we can read where Moses gave the Israelites the Ten Commandments. This was for that generation that came out of Egyptian captivity. And they were learning God's law at that point, what God expected of them. In Deuteronomy 5, verses 6 through 22, Moses is repeating the Ten Commandments. Moses is repeating the law to the next generation because the older generation had died all in the wilderness because of the 40 years of wandering. But Moses repeats this to the next generation so that as they went in to take the land of Canaan, they would know God's law and they would be ready to live by God's law. The Ten Commandments were part of the old law. The Ten Commandments were part of the law of Moses. They were not for anybody else. They were not specifically intended for anybody else but the Israelites. Then as Jesus came along, Jesus was born to Mary. He was born under the old law. He was born under the law of Moses. That is the law that Jesus lived by. That is the law that Jesus kept perfectly. That is the law that he was bound to. If you look over at Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, if you look over at Matthew chapter 5, and in verse 17, Jesus addresses the law because he was questioned about it early on. In Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled." Jesus was born under the law. Jesus kept the law, and he said that he did not come to destroy the law. He came to fulfill the law. And he fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the prophets. He fulfilled the prophecies that were made about him. He fulfilled them all concerning the Messiah that was to come. He fulfilled the law by being that perfect sacrifice for sin. He was that perfect, sinless sacrifice. When Jesus died on the cross, he fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the prophets. In John chapter 19 and verse 30, Jesus says he takes his final breath while he's on the cross. He says, "It is finished." This is the completion of God's plan of salvation. This is the completion of Christ's work while he was on this earth. He fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the prophets by his sacrifice on the cross. All the law and all the prophets were fulfilled at that time. We know this by what happened at the temple. Look over at Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, and Mark records what happened at the temple at Jesus' crucifixion when he died on the cross. In Mark chapter 15 and in verse 37, Mark 15 and in verse 37, Mark writes, "And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." This is significant because the direction that it tore from top to bottom. This is the fulfillment of all things. That curtain, that veil separated the holy place from the most holy place. Now it was open. After this, we can go over to the writings of Paul, and we can read what Paul had to say about Jesus fulfilling the old law and what it meant for Christians. In Galatians chapter 3, and in verse 24, Paul writes to the churches, and he says, "Therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor." You see, the law served its purpose. Jesus fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the prophets. And so the law was no longer needed. It served to bring man to Jesus Christ. Colossians chapter 2, and in verse 13, Paul writes to the church at Colossae, and Paul says, And you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. You see what happened when Jesus died on the cross, when he fulfilled the law, when he fulfilled the prophets, is the handwriting of requirements, the sacrifices, the actions that had to be taken under the old law, they were done away with. It was removed. It was contrary to us. Jesus is the only one who kept the law perfectly. But now it's taken out of the way. And we have to remember that Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia. They were made up primarily of Gentiles. Paul wrote to the church at Colossae, made up primarily of Gentiles. And so they had nothing to do with the old law to begin with. They had nothing to do with the law of Moses to begin with. But Jesus takes it out of the way. It's removed because Jesus died on the cross, because Jesus fulfilled all things. Then we go over to Ephesians chapter 2, and in verse 15, Ephesians chapter 2, and in verse 15, we'll go back to verse 14, and Paul writes, "For he himself is our peace, who made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments and ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace." Now, there was a difference between a Jew and a Gentile in the first century. But through Jesus Christ, all men, Jews and Gentiles alike, all men can be reconciled to God by their obedience to the gospel. And the law of commandments, the law of ordinances, was abolished by Jesus at his death, when he fulfilled the law and the prophets. You look over at Hebrews chapter 8. Over at Hebrews chapter 8, and in verse 13, the Hebrew writer simply says about the new covenant and the old covenant, in that he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. You see, the old law, the law of Moses, was obsolete under the gospel of Jesus Christ. What do we do with something that's obsolete? What do we do with our old phones, with our old laptops, with our old TVs? Generally, we dispose of them. We get rid of them because they're obsolete. This is what happened to the law of Moses. Jesus fulfilled the old law, and it was ready to be abolished. You look at Hebrews chapter 10, probably one page over, Hebrews chapter 10, and in verse 9, "Then he said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first, that he may establish the second." One has to go away for the other one to come into effect. And then we look over at Romans chapter 10 and verse 1. Paul writes there, and he's writing to specifically, he's addressing the Jews who were Christians in Rome. He writes to them, and he writes of his Jewish people. He says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Now, if we'll hold on to that, hold on to all these things that we've read, and go back over to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And Jesus said there in Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 17, "Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled." So when we have to be able to look at this and understand the fullness of what Jesus is saying. When the law is fulfilled, that the law will pass away, even down to the jot and the tittle. Even down to the smallest marks, the law is going to pass away. The old law, the law of Moses, was fulfilled by Jesus. Jesus fulfilled the law. He tells us that it's going to be removed when he fulfills it, if we understand verses 17 and 18. It was abolished through Jesus, through his death. It began on the day of Pentecost as the gospel was preached for the first time. People obeyed the gospel. They were baptized into Jesus Christ for the remission of their sins. The Lord added them to the church. The first was taken out of the way so that it could be replaced by the second, the better. The Hebrew letter in chapters 8, 9, and 10 talk about the better covenant. In fact, the Hebrew letter itself talks about the better covenant that is made through Jesus Christ. As part of the old law, the 10 Commandments have been removed. They've been taken away. They have been removed, and we're not bound to them anymore. Now, I'm not giving anybody authority, like we started with. I'm not giving anybody authority to murder and steal, because if you read the gospel of Jesus Christ, we can read that the commandments have been repeated in the gospel. And we need to be able to understand that the commandments, as they have been repeated to us, we are bound by them. And we need to remember that, and we need to hold to them. In chapter 6, we'll look specifically at these commandments as they've been repeated to us. And I have a small chart that we'll be able to look at and see the repetition of the commandments under the gospel of Jesus Christ. Hope you consider this. I hope you're willing to study with me on this, and I appreciate your attention. We'll see you next time.